All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at our 19th meeting of the CAWTAC and taking some time out of this. It's a gorgeous afternoon where I am in Beaverton. I don't know about the rest of you, but thanks for taking the time to be with us. Last meeting, we had a really good conversation about development-ready lands. I think we're going to be building on that conversation in future meetings. But today we're shifting a little bit to talk about proposed rules and guidance for partially vacant and redevelopment land for buildable land inventories. So what are reasonable assumptions and methodologies for determining the capacity, the development capacity of partially vacant land? And for estimating redevelopment potential. In your agenda that you were sent, there were two memos that were linked to. One was the discussion memo that, similar to what we've been sending out each month, that sets the framework for and provides the proposed rules and guidance. And then there also was a supporting memo from Echo Northwest that had some additional information and examples. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, you might want to pull those up to reference as we go along. Yeah, excited for this conversation today. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jenna to introduce our focus area and questions from the racial equity framework for today.
Great, thank you. And I think, yeah, that's perfect. All right, well, hi everyone. Good afternoon. So okay, sorry, I heard background noise, but it sounds like everyone's muted now. So for today's racial equity framework focus area, we're going to be focusing on accountability for today, and in particular, regarding how local governments accommodate their housing needs through their housing capacity analysis, and in particular, in how local governments estimate residential capacity for partially vacant and redevelopable land. Next slide, please. So under this focus area, we have a couple key questions for consideration. The first question is, what are the challenges and opportunities for accountability when trying to estimate local residential capacity and minimize phantom capacity? And are there some communities that are more burdened or challenged than others? So as we discussed last year when we were talking about BLIs or buildable land inventories, methodologies for estimating capacity for partially vacant and redevelopable land can vary greatly from city to city. And an overall lack of clarity and rule and guidance can make accountability especially challenging for both local governments and DLCD. And if a housing capacity analysis is not done in a way that is completely defensible, that can open local governments up to appeal risk, for example. So one way of helping ensure accountability is by adding clarification either in rule and or guidance that can increase certainty by creating a pathway for estimating capacity on these lands, which we'll be getting into later today. The second key question for consideration is, how can understanding where communities have residential capacity, what types of residential capacity that they have, and where they need more residential capacity create more equitable outcomes and restore or repair housing justice? So in addition to the number of units in a city's housing need allocation, local governments will also need to determine whether they have enough land capacity to accommodate what's in their contextualized housing need, which includes specific housing types, locations, and characteristics that are needed in their community. So the question is, how can rules and or guidance help create greater accountability to ensure that local governments are linking their HCA back to their contextualized housing need? and actually supporting the types of housing that are needed in the places where more capacity is needed to accommodate those types, especially thinking about benefiting affordable housing. So those are just some considerations to think about as we move through today's discussion. And I will now hand it back to you, Steve. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jenna. All right. The first topic on our agenda is partially vacant land. Karen's going to lead us through a brief presentation to remind us of what we've talked about previously and what we're discussing today. And then I'll be asking for clarifying questions. So let's hear what, let Karen remind us of what we've talked about to date and cue us up for today's conversation. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen Gijan Chapman with DLCD. Just a reminder, or just to orient us, that last time we met, we talked about development readiness and how to inventory land around that need, and how land is included in a development ready inventory and what might not be included or excluded from that inventory. And that's a really new concept. I think what we're more familiar with and what has been around Oregon's land use planning system for a long time is the buildable lands inventory. We previously had talked about constraints and how land can be excluded from that inventory or not considered buildable. And we're going to continue on that vein with the buildable lands inventory that requires a city to inventory the partially vacant land. And there's guidance out there on how to do that. In addition, I think it was the mid-90s introduced redevelopable land into the BLI, and that was the first time that cities were required to look at sites that could potentially convert to higher intensity residential or new residential development. So that's the focus of our conversation. That's kind of how it fits into the broader spectrum of capacity and urbanization for all of our conversations this year. All right, let's move through maybe a couple slides onto the next one. Okay, so what we heard from folks, our conversations, I think we spoke about this May of last year, so it was a year ago, and then we revisited it in September of last year. And just a quick summary of what we took away and what guided some of the rule concepts that you see here. We heard from the group that it has been documented that not all buildable land develops within that 20-year planning period. And so we kind of all agreed and established that. There were questions from the membership on the committee around planned unit developments, CCNRs, other uses on residentially designated land or residentially zoned land. It could be a school or a church on this residential land. And TAC members noted that there are ever-changing market forces, whether that is a pandemic like COVID or a recession, things of that nature, and how different communities are impacted by those changing market forces can vary. So during COVID, the impacts to a city like Portland might have varied very differently than the impacts to, say, Hillsborough, Beaverton, or, say, Grants Pass or Medford. And we left that September meeting with the direction from the TAC membership that staff should look into some kind of a discount to the capacity that's assumed on partially vacant land during the buildable lands inventory. So that's what we took away from our conversations last year. And here's what we bring to you today for consideration. And if you have your memo in front of you, that's great. If you haven't had a chance to read the memo, we'll highlight a few things that we'll pull out of that memo for good of the order. So we offer a definition in hopes that this would create greater clarity and certainty so we understand the difference between partially vacant land that has development potential, additional development potential, and redevelopment land that will convert to, so it's land that's been developed but has the potential to convert. So this definition hopefully will resonate with folks. I think we're eager to hear from you if this is how you've been inventorying your partially vacant land, and does this reflect that well and accurately for that clarification. The next significant thing we do is in the next slide, we introduced something called a land supply market factor. And we looked as an example in Washington, they have a program for urban growth areas. That program is very different than Oregon's urban growth boundary framework that we use in our land use system. But nonetheless, we could pull some nuggets from there and propose a concept to allow cities to discount some capacity. And I'll note for folks that we already have a couple safe harbors that are available to small cities. So small cities, when they're inventorying their partially vacant land, can look at 1 acre parcels and half-acre parcels and assumed full development if they're a city of 25,000 or less. So those safe harbors for smaller cities will remain. This will be a third option, and it will be available to cities of all sizes. So larger cities, while those safe harbors that exist in rural today are not available to cities above 25,000, this would be available provided that a city can show their work. So it does require some quantifiable validation. I'll just note here that in Washington, over the time they've had a land supply market factor, I think there's been case law, there's been certainly local political pressures, things of that nature. And you'll see in practice, it usually for residential land that's partially vacant, it'll fall under 25% that it gets discounted, assuming that 75% of partially vacant land in an inventory will develop over that 20-year planning period. Okay, so the next slide, I'll briefly go over how we responded to what we thought we could bring into rule and what we think should be focus areas for future guidance. So the part of the charge, the charge given to us by our commission was to provide additional clarity and legal certainty to reduce redundancy and analytical burden for cities. And so I think in an effort to provide clarity, we offer the definition that you just saw. And then to maintain and add additional flexibility, we retain the 2 safe harbors for smaller cities, and we add an opportunity for cities of all sizes to discount some estimated capacity. I think what we look forward to next year, as you know, should the rules reflect these approaches, is how would a city incorporate that market factor? What are examples out there? Are there any best practices and lessons to be learned that we could apply here in Oregon? I think there's very specific considerations when estimating the deductions and how you deduct for a market factor. And then there are ways cities are showing their work and demonstrating those calculations and their math behind it. And we could provide all of that in guidance so cities have those resources available to them. All right, that is a brief, quick overview of what's in your memo, but happy to answer any questions about what you read in the memo or what you heard today from me.
All right, clarifying questions about partially vacant land and the proposed rules and guidance. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Regarding the term reasonable land market supply factor, can you provide some examples of what a city might use under that situation to identify that factor? And also wanted to clarify that this is something that a city could they could show their work, document in the record, like here's our data, here's our methodology for estimating this factor and how it affects our available land supply, if that's what this is trying to capture. Thank you.
Yeah, it's examples that we looked at were largely based on historical development trend data. So you would look at in your previous cycle or since your last acknowledged housing capacity analysis, what has developed and what hasn't, and what percentage do you expect will develop moving forward. I think you can look at very specific things. Maybe some cities have a high percentage of CCNRs, other cities don't. You can look at a percentage of, we have residentially designated land, but it's used for golf courses or schools or churches. So you can start to factor in, we know there's land that's inventoried, but the partially vacant portions of that are less likely to develop. And we can demonstrate that by looking at past cycles of development for a period from the last adopted or acknowledged HCA.
Thanks, Conan. So that obviously involves having the data too, right? Tracking the data so that you can provide that evidence, which I'm not sure all communities are doing. So that's something to think about. Martha?
Thanks. I have a question. I just want to make sure I'm understanding how all of these pieces fit together. And so when you read the rules, it talks about inventorying vacant and redevelopable land. Is the partially vacant land a third category that we're going to talk about, or is it a subset of the vacant land or the redevelopable land? Because my understanding is vacant means there's no development on it. Partially vacant means there's some development, but there's room for more development, right? There's extra property land there. And redevelopable is really about properties that have already been developed, but may, for market reasons or financial reasons, may actually redevelop into something over the different over the next 20 years. And I guess I'm trying to piece all of these things together with these definitions that you're proposing, and I'm not quite clear on that. So
yeah, let me give it a try and let me know if this helps. So you're absolutely right. Vacant has no development on it, or it may have development, maybe a threshold like $10,000 and below. I don't know. What is that? A pole barn? I don't know. Anyway,
yeah, like
it
a
has no
shed or
residential
something. Yeah.
So that's our vacant. And then partially vacant has residential development. It is designated and rezoned for residential development, but there's enough within that parcel that it potentially could be subdivided. So it has potential and capacity for additional development under its current zoning standards. And then redevelopable is that third class. So we've got two categories, and then the third is, well, this is fully developed, but we have reason to believe that it might redevelop. And the way I've understood it is it often involves a demolition.
Okay.
So if there is a urban renewal district or a TIF district, and sometimes local knowledge will know there's a high potential. The most obvious one is land banked. I can think of a specific example that comes to my head of a commercial furniture store, and the way it was zoned would allow for residential development. The city had that knowledge and knew that it was land banked by a public entity, and that they had plans to convert that commercial use into residential. And sure enough, 5 years later, built a high density residential multi-unit. And it did involve the demolition. And so it's a conversion.
Right.
You could convert a single dwelling unit, a home, and create more intense residential use.
Okay. Can I follow up real quick? I know there's other people waiting.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if that's the case, so your vacant and partially vacant in your inventory is really more of sort of geographic look, for lack of a better term, sorry. And then the redevelopable is based on something like the strike price or market factors. And so I guess, but when you talk about how much of that partially vacant might develop, that's when you sort of get into potentially market factors, I guess. And so when you're talking in here about, sorry, there's 8,000 dogs barking behind me for some reason. When you talk in here about the market, I'm looking for the right term. What's the term I'm looking for?
Is it land supply market factor?
Yeah, the market factors. Why are we talking about it only applying to partially vacant land or to identify partially vacant land? To me, you identify the land and then the market factors potentially used to understand how much development might happen there or how much of the redevelopable land might redevelop. Am I misunderstanding that?
You're on mute, Karin.
Sorry about that. Let's have a look. I am going to pull up some notes I have from our discussion in May of last year. I think as a group, what we talked about was a market factor to reduce the capacity of partially vacant land, because that analysis is done citywide across all parcels that meet the qualifications for partially vacant. Redevelopable land, when we talked about it last year in May, I think Beth from Echo Northwest brought us the examples of Gresham and Milwaukee. And the way most cities are doing it locally when they look at redevelopment, it's local knowledge that is known, or very specific factors that are known, that are a few sites in the city that have potential for redevelopment. So again, it's the demolition and conversion of a site. Aside from Metro and maybe the city of Portland, applying a methodology like strike price or pro forma models across every eligible parcel, I don't believe cities are doing that. Historically, they haven't done that in their HNAs. And it isn't something we're going to ask cities to begin to do, is to start applying a methodology citywide across all eligible parcels for redevelopment. And that's why you're seeing a reduction for partially vacant, because they're required to inventory all those parcels citywide, versus you're not seeing it for redevelopment, because we've never required that you inventory all parcels that might be eligible under a methodology for redevelopment. So I would say redevelopment is already heavily discounted, while partially vacant is not.
I'm going to call on Beth. Thanks, Karin, to provide some additional clarity.
Part of the issue here we're having is a little bit of language. Washington State uses the term market factor, and what they mean is some amount that you can assume of land that won't develop. So the market factor might be 10% of land, 20% of land, 25% of land, but that market factor is something that the state allows for use of, and it's not necessarily implying that you have to do an analysis to prove why that is the case. So I think there's a little confusion around the term market factor, because there's market information that Damien was talking about that might go into, saying, why do we think it is that 15% of partially vacant land will not develop in the future rather than 25% or 35%. Right now, all land that a city identifies as partially vacant is assumed to develop over the 20-year period, or, will develop over the 20-year period. I don't know if that helps you, Martha.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Karin. Good question, Martha. Ted?
Thank you. I have a few comments may get in, or a few questions that may get into commentary more than questions. So I'll hold on those unless you want them now.
No, we'd like just the clarifying question.
Yeah, so clarifying question. Metro has for a long time just sort of assumed that we have this ability to look at market factors when it comes to infill and redevelopment. So I'm curious what the need is for this language to assert that you have this ability to consider market factors. Have cities elsewhere in the state run into questions about whether they're allowed to do this?
Yeah, I think we heard from City of Eugene and Heather, if you have any response to that, but the rules currently allow smaller cities to take a couple safe harbors, and there were none for cities of 25,000 or larger. And so cities have been expected to inventory their partially vacant land and assume full capacity on whatever's inventory is partially vacant.
Beth, did you have something to add to that? No.
I'll just say that is our interpretation of what we've been doing. We've occasionally taken an approach similar to what Metro has taken on partially vacant. about I think parcel size and value of the existing unit. But that's not something that's very clearly allowed, in my opinion, in the rules.
Thanks. Ted, did you have another question for now?
No, most of my other questions are really kind of comments. So
Okay, thanks for holding those. Derek.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I was just curious if, and I don't mean to be too wonky here, but if there's any value or even a need to clarify what constitutes a lot or parcel for purposes analysis, because as we all know, those are all tax assessor maps that are used for this analysis. And we have in our community, for example, quite a few of those represent aggregated lots. So you have, two or three or more lots that are under common ownership. They get reflected in the analysis as a single tax lot, but, maybe only one of those actual lots has something on it, like a home. And then the other lots that they own, they have available. They're just choosing not to develop them. And often we find those are the ones that are more often than not to get developed as infill development as the owner's circumstances change. They decide to sell one or more of those vacant lots that they still own. And you have somebody pick it up and develop it.
Thanks, Derek. That seems like something that we should consider if we haven't already, Colin. Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mhm.
Mary Kyle.
I had a clarifying question, but first on the redevelopable thing, my understanding is that a market factor is already built into it in those places that try to estimate redevelopable land, because it's looking at the relationship. I mean, as you have in the memo, the relationship between the value of the improvement and the value of the land, and and what that is in my experience at various cities that have used this, is cities vary it depending on what that means in their own city for the likelihood of redevelopment. So I think there's already a discount factor on the redevelopable land, and it's different from partially vacant land. But my question was on the definition of partially vacant land under 0005 sub 45. So it says that partially vacant land refers to buildable lands, blah, 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 where it can be further developed within the assigned zoning standards. And I wondered what the assigned zoning standards are. Are those with or without what's been adopted or might have been adopted in a housing production strategy or efficiency measures? I just not sure what's in that term.
I think it would be whatever is current in the development code at this time of what it would be allowed. So if you had, let's say a 10,000 square foot home and the city has a minimum lot size, it probably wouldn't allow for any further development and partition. But if a city had a 10,000 square foot lot and there was a 5,000 minimum lot size, then you would look at those standards and say, well, there's some potential. It depends on constraints. How much of that land is constraints? What are the setbacks? So you would take all of that into account. But Beth, I think we do that now with our partially vacant, how a local city determines that there's additional development potential on a residential that's already been developed.
Well, and I was thinking more if a city has made a commitment in their HPS to housing production strategy to take actions over their 6 or 8 year period that might result in more development being possible on that partially vacant
I'll venture
land.
out to answer that second follow-up. Thanks. And Beth, let me know.
Yeah.
I think it would be whatever is locally adopted.
Not committed to being adopted 2 years down the line, but
I
what's
wouldn't
actually
feel
adopted.
comfortable, but
Okay.
Beth, you've done a lot of these across the state.
It's whatever is currently adopted. And Mary Kyle, in a city that's looking at a UGB expansion, you do the HCA based on what's currently adopted.
Right.
You look at land use efficiency measures. You say, how much more efficiency could that get us?
Right.
You adopt those land use efficiency measures and concurrent with when you're using those new assumptions. So we've gone from being able to do 5.3 dwelling units an acre on average to being able to do 6. My UGB expansion is decreased by X and such amount based on those land use efficiency measures, which I'm adopting at the same time that I'm adopting the analysis that will use them, or before I'm adopting the analysis that will use them. So
Thanks. That's helpful in that sense. And I was wondering, even when there's not a UGB expansion on the table, but we're just doing a buildable lands inventory and an HPS, if a city's made a commitment to do something that could result in more development, or should anyway. Okay, well, we might revisit those as we see how the whole HPS owner
Sounds
process
good.
rolls out. Thanks.
Sounds good. Let's go to Corey, and then after Corey, let's go to our poll. Oh, Heather, fine. We'll take Heather too, and then we'll go to the poll.
Sorry, and I think Kevin was trying to jump in there with an additional comment.
I just wanted to clarify the issue you were just discussing, I think, is exactly where we look at that 3% cap language in statute that says, hey, you can't assume more efficiency unless you have quantifiable validation. And that's where we're looking for the local government to say, hey, we adopted this new standard. Here's the numbers. Here's the quantifiable validation. We're going to get this many units, not that many units. So that's kind of where we look at this issue. Yeah.
I meant more where, like, say, a piece of lot, if it's adopted in the future, as in their HPS, could go from allowing 2 more houses to 20 more houses. That's not an efficiency measure. That's just, we're zoning it differently to upzone it. So, but we may just have to see how that plays out as with this first iteration of.
Sure. But I'll say, Mary
HPS
Kyle,
as an
that
owner.
I believe that kind of rezone action is an efficiency measure, and it's one of the most frequent efficiency measures that we see.
Yeah,
All right.
I've seen uncomfortableness between, is that an efficiency, because we have different statutes adopted at different times that aren't always talking the same language. I get it. You have a challenge.
Sure.
All right. Thank you both. Let's work through these questions and get to our poll. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, so my question had to do, since it sounds like we're looking to Washington for their example on this, and I think Karen's mentioned that this tends to land around 25%. And so I was curious, and it's actually maybe a question for Ted, since it sounds like the metro area is already doing this. Like, does that track? Is that a similar percentage that's showing up when they're doing that work? So just kind of get a sense of, like, scale and if 25% is average or high. So maybe a question for Ted of just what that percentages look like when they've looked at market factors.
Corey, I'll have to get back to everyone on that. I do know that combined redevelopment and infill is a significant portion of our growth capacity in the metro region. When we look back historically, the last urban growth report in 2018 found that over the previous decade, about 3/4 of our new housing units were through redevelopment and infill. Our most recent urban growth report that we just adopted was about half of the new units were redevelopment and infill, but I'd have to look and see what the breakout is for those two.
Thanks. Heather?
Yeah, thanks for letting me ask the question. I was waiting to see if anyone else was going to ask it, but it's about the definition, partially vacant definition, saying that the lot or parcel has to have existing residential development. And I was curious how staff was thinking about that in the context of, climate friendly areas or other kind of mixed use encouragement that's happening with the state rules, looking for more of our kind of higher density, or at least in Eugene, higher density land around climate friendly areas, that we might either change the code to allow for commercial. It might already have commercial on it. And so now we're just trying to make it easier to do commercial and housing. But if it's partially vacant and it has a business on it in a residential area, we wouldn't be able to count it here. So just trying to understand what the thinking is around that, or if there's an opportunity I mean, I can make that comment later. And then I think my other thing I just wanted to mention about partially vacant is the question about what we do, in case this informs the discussion about what we do with partially vacant. We don't really have the capacity, given our size, to do a lot by lot level analysis of partially vacant. We did that the first time and that was wild. And so we have tried to automate that a little bit more. And so, you know, getting into setbacks or shadow platting would be really challenging for every lot. And it also doesn't really address middle housing, which doesn't necessarily need to divide. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Kevin. Kynan, did you want to respond to the question about non-residential development?
Yeah, I think the first one, I think this definition doesn't change, to my understanding, this definition doesn't change the way partially vacant has been inventoried in that respect. It just defines the way we inventory it, that all residentially designated land. And I think the way it currently happens, and Beth and Kevin help me out, is commercial and mixed use. Cities are looking at past development trends and saying, well, here's what I'm seeing on commercially designated and mixed use, and I'm going to estimate that capacity forward. And certainly you can estimate up to 3% more. I think we heard from Medford in May of last year. They're like, we're able to estimate even more than 3%, and we can quantifiably validate that, how much residential we're getting out of commercial and mixed use. It doesn't change the way it's been estimated.
Beth?
Sorry. So the part I was having a question about, it says the parcel has existing residential development on it, not that it's zoned or planned. So that was my question. Like, if it's a larger lot and it's got a commercial development on it, but it's residentially zoned, according to this definition, we wouldn't be able to count capacity on it for partially vacant. So sorry if that was confusing.
It looks like Beth maybe wants to respond to this specifically. Is that right, Beth?
I was going to say it probably just should say residential or commercial, or in some way acknowledge that this could be residentially or commercially zoned land, or land where needed housing is, you know, allowed outright with clear and objective standards, which is a really long phrase. And Karen, when it comes to how you estimate capacity in commercial, we've done it a little bit differently than what you're describing, but it's really similar to what you're describing. So
Thanks, Beth. Let's go to Ken and then to our poll, please.
Yeah, actually, Heather raised the question that I had, but I didn't hear an answer. It's really how middle housing factors into partially vacant. I mean, you know, I understood like when Karen gave the example of a 10,000 square foot lot and a zoning of 5,000 with a 10,000 square foot lot, that makes a lot of sense for partially vacant. But when you take middle housing into account, it really kind of throws everything out the window.
Hey, and Kevin, help me out here, but I believe this is when the 3% rule would apply, that you're allowing additional uses in a designated zone. And you can assume that past capacity, and you can go above up to 3%.
Right. It was the middle housing bill that established a 3% cap. But, you know, as we see more middle housing development, if cities are seeing more than 3% increase, absolutely, you know, track that data. And now you've got quantifiable validation to support more land use efficiency.
And
Portland's the example that's quantified that or validated that.
Could just add in there a little bit, you're starting off with the historical density for the zone. So if it starts off at five dwelling units an acre and you add 3% to that, that's like 5.15 dwelling units an acre. But in 10 years from now, 3 years from now, whatever, at some point we'll see, you know, that 5 dwelling units an acre having been changed by the fact that middle housing development has happened. And so instead of seeing 5 dwelling units an acre, maybe you'll see, you know, 5.75 or 6 or 8, whatever, I don't know.
Thank you, everyone. Let's go to our poll asking if you support the approach as it's stated in the discussion memo, support with minor modifications, or if you think major changes are needed. All right. Okay. This is probably building on the clarifying questions, but a number of people said minor modifications. So if anyone who said as much wants to clarify what those minor modifications are, please do so, starting with Martha.
Thanks. Actually, Heather and Mary Kyle brought up both two things I was going to bring up. One is the fact that the definition specifies residential development. I think that I don't think that it should. I think it should just be development on a property. I don't think we care. I mean, if there's what's on the property, if there's room to develop more, right? And someone wants to put housing there. I mean, overall, I guess I should have started with, I agree with the approach with what you're proposing to put into guidance versus into rule. But I just think that this definition of partially vacant land needs to be tweaked a little bit. And that would be one of the tweaks. I also twitched a little bit with the can be further developed within the assigned zoning standards. I feel like that could be more straightforward. And I don't have an exact wording for you, but I think because we're talking about partially vacant that has extra sort of land, right? It's not developed to its full potential. And so, I mean, I feel like there's another way to word that that's a little more clear that we're talking about like the site can accommodate additional development based on its, zoning designation or something like that to me would make more sense. And then my final comment about the definition, and I don't know if anyone will agree with me, and that's okay if you don't, but I feel like defining partially vacant land as buildable lands, buildable lots is a little bit circular because earlier in that section in 660 Division 8005, buildable land is defined as vacant and and redevelopable land. And so I don't know that you need that word buildable in there. I just find it circular. I think putting in, if you want it residentially zoned land or whatever you want that to be. Those are my comments. Just some tweaking.
Thanks, Martha. Let's go to Ted.
I agree with the comments that Martha and Heather have made about getting rid of the word residential and in the definition for existing residential development for the reasons they mentioned. The other thing that I had on my mind was in the clause on land inventory when it starts out, when inventorying partially vacant land, it goes on with quantifiable validation for deductions. I'm wondering if we can get rid of the words for deductions, simply because the way that we approach this is what should we be counting in terms of infill, not what should we be deducting. So I think getting rid of the words for deductions gets us there. You just have to provide quantifiable validation for what you're doing and the methodology.
Thanks, Ted. That's helpful. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I think my comments are going to sound a little redundant, but I think with respect to the new definition 45 for partially vacant lands, I concur with changing it to refer to existing development, whether that's a house, a business, a church, something I'm not thinking of right now. I also wanted to talk about the phrase assigned zoning standards. I was trying to think of a different way to say it, like the applicable development regulations or something unique to the base zone in which the property is located, so that there would be that support to the local government to maybe use a more automated approach where they're looking at a body of lots of parcels, and they could then use their GIS to calculate what that development may be under there. Because I concur with Heather's comments about not going through the pain of doing a lot by lot evaluation.
Thanks,
Thank
Damien.
you.
Brock.
Yeah, similar lines. I agree with Martha and Heather and Damien and Ted and everyone else who spoke on this.
We don't have to name every name.
Yeah. Taking the residential out and the buildable out. In regards to the land inventory response piece, I guess maybe this is a question for Ted. Would you be more comfortable with the word adjustments instead of deductions? Just because it is like a scaling factor, right? and I can understand if you don't want to use the word deductions there, but I think adjustments, just to clarify that that's what it's about, like the scale factor that's being used.
I guess I'd be curious if adjustments has a new meaning, a new connotation with recent legislation that we might want to avoid. I think just dropping the words for deductions would do it for me, but I'm open to other suggestions.
Thanks. Heather?
The only other thing that I would add, agreeing with everything that I heard, is, and I'm guessing if we're at this point that that's probably not going to happen, but I'm just going to say it anyway, is that I'd still love to see a safe harbor in the land inventory and response section for larger cities. I read the memo and I understand, I think, how we got here, but I just want to flag that in the interest of, trying to have a process that is, has less appeal opportunity and is more clear, like everyone kind of understands what we're doing and we're not being, I mean, we could be subjective, but there is still a way to not be subjective. So I'll just flag that. Otherwise, I agree with what everybody has said.
Thanks, Heather. Before we go to Martha, I just wanted to follow up on what you said and pose a question that we had asked internally, which is, is the market factor, are we taking the right approach in making the market factor an option for cities rather than there being a more generalized safe harbor? So I think maybe your comment, Heather, was more general about safe harbor, but or maybe not, but like, so that's something that we'd like to hear from the group is should there be a safe harbor, or is this approach of making it an option the right path to follow? So think about that while we go to Martha. Oh, sorry, Heather, if you go ahead.
Can I respond really quick?
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, please.
I want it all. So I would love to have a safe harbor as well as the option to do the land market supply factor, because I actually think that those are a little bit different. The safe harbor is helping you figure out what might have capacity based on kind of whatever that assigned zoning standards is, really. Whereas the factor is really saying, but we think that of all the partially vacant land supply, 10% is actually not going to is not going to develop because if there's a bunch of CCNRs in this community, there's a bunch of golf courses in this community, whatever it is. So to me, they're a little bit different. So thanks for letting me respond.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Go ahead, Martha.
I should just always go after Heather because she articulated what I wanted to say, I think, very well. I think they're two different things. I think the safe harbor that's listed under here for the small cities helps you identify what's partially vacant, just like your total inventory. But this market factor helps you identify what might actually develop, right, in your time frame. And I would like to see both too. I think that's a great idea. And I guess I read the memo and maybe I wasn't paying enough attention. I wasn't totally clear why there isn't this sort of safe harbor to identify partially vacant land for larger cities, which I assume that urban unincorporated lands in the counties would fall into the larger cities. And yeah, and I'm with you, Ted, the quantifiable validation for deductions and documentation of methodology used language threw me a little bit when I read that definition. Again, I feel like we just need to be a little more straightforward what we're saying. You're inventorying your partially vacant land, but you can use this market supply factor and I don't know, to then determine how much of the land is likely to redevelop in your planning period or some, like, say what we really mean by it. I wasn't quite sure when I first read it what that meant.
Thanks, Martha. Brock?
Yeah, I think with the safe harbor that's currently in rule plus the new addition, I think that's good. And I agree. I think we should take out the restriction on the middle portion, right? So currently it's only if you're below 25,000, or if you're in a metro service district. But I think if we just pull that out, it's still a may, right? So it is optional, but I think expanding that to medium-sized and larger cities would be good as well.
Thanks, Brock. Karin, and this maybe to Kevin and Beth, I had two questions. One, is there a reason why, why it applies to cities, the safe harbor applies to cities of certain size that we want to share with folks? And then number two, back to the definition, and folks talked about removing the word buildable. Is the word buildable intended to, differentiate between land that has like environmental constraints on it versus land that doesn't? And so I don't think buildable is redundant. I think it's there to talk about a specific type of land. But Karin, do you have any thoughts about the safe harbor question? I saw you nodding about my buildable piece, but
You caught me. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head on the buildable piece. Kevin, I'm just going to make assumptions, and maybe I shouldn't on the record, but the safe harbors that are there are pretty large. And I can't imagine giving that safe harbor that's there to Beaverton or to Medford so that's my assumption of why the safe harbors are only for cities at 25,000 or below.
Yeah, that's been kind of my thinking, but again, back at legislative history for why that is. Beth?
Oh, we've always interpreted it. I've always assumed the exact same thing. And the way we've started some of these conversations with cities is saying, okay, city, you're above 25,000. Let's start with the safe harbor for partially vacant land, which says if you've got a parcel that's bigger than, I think, an acre, that you can assume, and it's got one dwelling unit on it, you can assume that a quarter acre there stays with that dwelling unit, and the rest is available for development. So the way we've started by using that and sort of whittling it down there. Eugene's a very extreme example of where that approach did not work at all. The thing to realize is that when you've got a small parcel, let's say it's an acre and a half parcel, where the house is seated on the parcel matters. If it's smack dab in the middle, then it's hard to subdivide. Even if you want to subdivide into kind of smaller lots, smaller than 10,000 acres, 10,000 square feet. If it's at the corner of the parcel, then it's way easier to imagine you get a bunch of 5,000 square foot lots out of that if that's your development standard. And on a bigger piece of land, let's just skip up to, I don't know, 5 acres, but this almost certainly applies above 2 acres. Where the house is going to influence future development patterns on that land, but it also is a little irrelevant. So it's most important on those smaller parcels where the future development is just harder in a lot of different ways.
Thanks, Beth. Karin, did you have any other specific questions that you wanted to ask the group? And if not, I think maybe we can transition to our conversation about redevelopable lands.
I think we're ready.
Okay.
All right, let's see what we've got here. So if we go on to that very next slide, here's what we gathered from our conversations last year around redevelopment. We walked through and we talked about different experiences using a variety of methods available. There were examples in the metro region around forecasting and what's been done there for redevelopment. It was shared, and I think it was agreed that there's a lot of assumptions that go into that forecasting for redevelopment, many of which are outside of a city's control, and the results are highly sensitive to these assumptions that go into the analysis work. We also acknowledge that different regions around the state have different market conditions. I think there was even a little bit of discussion of one side of town might have certain market conditions that make lots or parcels more likely redevelopment than another side of town. So it really varies by geography. And then lastly, there was a discussion around, well, infrastructure conditions. Those have often a very direct impact, whether a parcel can be developed or not, if the infrastructure is available to do that. And then we look at existing rules in our next slide. And I think here's where, while buildable land inventories and that definition has both partially vacant and redevelopable, I think redevelopable was introduced into statute, I think in the mid-90s, and therefore during rulemaking, the department created this definition for redevelopable to distinguish it from partially vacant. So we have a definition for this land. And then we have in Division 24, describing how redevelopable land, or excuse me, how buildable land is determined, the mix and density. I actually think I might have, looking at the slide now, it's throwing me off because I think I might have the wrong rule there. My apologies, there's a typo in there. So as we looked at what's existing in rule, how it's been applied and practiced, and then guidance that's a bit outdated that came during legislation in the mid-90s, we then looked and asked ourselves, what do we want in rule and what do we want in guidance? So I think that next slide kind of breaks down for you that we know there's a couple updates we need to make. We have some statutory changes. Also, we need to reflect in our rules the OHNA housing need allocation. I think there was a population projection that was used that the rule refers to. So we do have a couple amendments to rule, mostly conforming amendments. And then what we're looking at for guidance is how do we provide cities with examples of those methodologies that have been used, and then best practices and lessons learned, and how many cities are doing their estimates. So we hope to be able to share that in any guidance material, so there's a little bit more robust information there. And I think we're on slide 16. There we go. Perfect. So with that, you'll notice that we do not have any large changes, nor did we hear a desire from our conversations from last year for any significant amendments to rules, and we couldn't find any rationale for that. But it did feel like among the discussions that cities are like, well, how do we account for redevelopable outside of Portland Metro being a very unique region in the state? And what Portland Metro is doing may not apply to, say, a Southern Oregon Metro, or even to a Mid-Willamette Valley metropolitan area. So we've decided that probably most of our resources would be better put around guidance and examples and tools and resources for cities to come next year. Not a whole lot to chew on to clarify, but if there are any clarifying questions around our approach or what that means or what current rules, I'm happy to entertain those. Steve.
Thanks, Karen. Any clarifying questions? Mary Kyle, please.
I have, this is the same issue that I think was brought up in the last discussion about why it's limited to land zone for residential use, when whether you're looking at redevelopable potential or the partially vacant, especially because we've had legislation that allows residential use in commercial buildings as of right without a zone change, and then certain kinds of residential use on certain kinds of commercially zoned lands, affordable housing on commercially zoned lands without a zone change. So the current definition talks only about land zone for residential use. That seems too narrow based on past legislation, and also just zones that have a mix of uses or parking lots or other things like that that could have redevelopment potential.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. We can revisit that after our poll. Let's continue with clarifying questions.
Thought that was clarifying.
It's a little of both.
Yeah, but it's the same issue that came up in the last discussion.
Yeah.
So,
well, if Conan, if you have a response, welcome to provide it now.
Yeah, I might as well again. I think this was part of rulemaking in the mid-90s, so I don't think any of us were there when the definitions written. So
I was.
apologies for that. But I see your point. I certainly see your point. And I believe despite the definition, it's been practiced that where residential uses are allowed. But it doesn't say that. So
Yeah.
Let me think on that. Let me think on that.
Yeah, I think it's the same issue that was brought up in the last discussion, or
Yeah.
one of the issues. Thanks.
Thank you.
That's what I was going to comment on too, and I think it again ties in with both. But I actually want to direct us to the definition that's in the next rack packet, because I think that zone to allow definition there for the development ready lands. I think that's kind of what Mary Kyle is getting at. Is it? Yeah. Is that correct, Mary? The zone to allow as opposed to just residentially zoned.
Or it allows. I don't know if zone to allow is the right term or not, but statute has allowed it. So I'm not a planner. I don't know the exact terminology, but that's closer. I think, yeah.
Thanks, Brock.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that, both of you. Thank you.
Damien?
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. Just a clarifying question on the draft guidance concepts. I think this is a really good start. With respect to the bullet on example methodologies, would that include examples of cities of different sizes so that if, cities of 50 to 60,000 wanted to get some ideas on how to do this, they could look to other cities of that same size? It may seem like an obvious question, but just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mystery to me how much I'm going to find for examples out there. And to be absolutely franking, and I think we're going to lean a lot on our consulting firms. What have cities done? What's out there? We might have to look even beyond Oregon, even though I've said, example methodologies used within Oregon. So to be determined, but yes, my hope ideally would be we would have samples that would cross different types of jurisdictions by size.
Okay, thank you.
Heather?
So thinking about partially vacant and redevelopment, particularly smaller lots, and this is a little bit where I get into the safe harbor for partially vacant that I talked about, because the safe, and I wasn't suggesting using the same safe harbor because I understand that it would be different for larger cities. Or it would make more sense for it to be different. But the key with that is that it says residential lots or parcels 1/2 acre or more. And I'm just thinking, do we have enough information with the way partially vacant is now drafted to be defined, and the way redevelopable land is not being changed, although I agree with what's been said about adding land zone to allow residential use, or however we want to phrase that. But do we have enough information to understand where small developed lots, what category they would fit into if we're assuming development on them? And I'm trying to not think about my preconceived notions about how we've done it, which was, one was looking at where we used 1 acre as a threshold. If it was over an acre and developed, then we looked at it for partially vacant capacity. If it was under an acre and developed, we looked at it for redevelopment capacity. None of this gives us those thresholds to help us figure out where to put development on smaller lots, I feel like. So, and so I'm more asking the question, if it's under an acre or even under 1/2 an acre, how is staff thinking about where development on those lots would go in kind of an urban setting?
I see you unmuted, Kat, and I was wondering if that was a Kevin question.
Yeah, I was going to answer Heather's question with another question, because I can't answer your question, so maybe we will defer to Kevin, we'll see. But are we talking about small parcels to determine partially vacant, or small parcels to determine redevelopable, or both? You're talking about just small parcels in general?
Yeah, just small parcels that have development on them. Like where am I putting expected development on them?
Yeah, I think many small parcels that have residential development, they have not been inventoried as partially vacant. So you've got these residential parcels with a dwelling unit on it. And then to Ken's point, like, or your and Ken, both you had this point about, well, how do I estimate middle housing, the potential for middle housing? And I think that's new to us, but we understand that up to 3%, we'll see.
Yeah.
But otherwise, you use your past development trend data. I think for redevelopment, in my mind, that is just irregardless of parcel size. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong. If something's going to redevelop, I've seen really small parcels develop from commercial where residential was allowed, and it became like a 20-unit multi-dwelling building, residential building. So I don't see how you would. I'm thinking about your program, Heather, in specific. I don't see how you would automate that by parcel size for redevelopment.
Yeah.
But let's pause for a second. Anybody else have anything I said that was incorrect or doesn't land or something to add to that?
See Kevin saying no, and I don't see Beth unmuting, so.
I guess I'd just add, I think it might go back to, just as a suggestion, and it's not that it's easy to model, but it may go back to what you said earlier, Karen, that if you're in like a 5,000 square foot zoning base, then double that would be partially vacant, and less than that would be redevelopment, but then it would be like zone specific. So I'm not sure it helps with modeling, but it seems logical and gets at the question Heather raised.
Yeah, I think, yes, I agree, Ken. And I just feel like, you and I share an experience in Gresham where I can think of specific areas that we knew were catalysts for redevelopment. We just knew it would spur. And you would assume you could map some key areas that you thought. But outside of that, I'm thinking of neighborhoods that I know really well in Gresham or in Portland. I'm like, there's no way to know if that lot will redevelop just because it can, because the zoning allows for it. I don't know that there will be a demo and a redevelopment, and the market may not be able to push it to convert. So, but that's anecdotal. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Let's go to Brock and then do our poll.
Oh, yeah, you're good. Just a quick clarification. For the changes that are made to the allocation of buildable land statute, that Division 8-110, we're changing it to housing needs allocation instead of projection. I'm fine with housing needs allocation being in there, but shouldn't it be the contextualized housing need, or maybe both? Because the allocation that you're getting from DAS is just quantity and price point, right? And then the CHN is what you use to determine mix and density and things like that, right?
Okay, I could stand to be corrected on this one as well, but I believe the housing unit count that comes from that housing need allocation is the capacity a city is working towards.
Yeah, the capacity of production they're working towards. But when we're talking about mix and
Oh, no,
density,
no, yeah.
by
You've given me another opportunity. I think it was Damien last time that gave me this opportunity. So our 20-year housing need allocation is the capacity a city needs over that 20-year planning period. And the housing production target is what a city needs to work towards during their production cycle for cities of 10,000. So all cities are demonstrating a residential capacity towards their 20-year housing need allocation and the number of units that are provided in that allocation.
Okay.
And I know I keep splitting those hairs in that nuance there. So let me know if that makes sense or if we need to revisit that.
I'll take a look and circle back.
Okay.
Thank you.
Martha, do you have a clarifying question before we go to our poll?
No, I can wait.
Okay.
It was similar to what Brock was talking about, but I can wait.
All right, Ingrid, let's pull up our poll, please. All right. I'm seeing a trend in our polls. We're getting close, but we need some minor modifications. So let's start with you, Martha, in terms of, well, whatever
Sure.
you had to say, but particularly if there
But
are.
I also click number 2 because
Okay.
again, I agree with the approach in terms of like guidance versus rule changes. I do agree with that. Again, it's just minor tweaks. I agree with the comment about this zone for residential use term and then in the second one in the land inventory in response to deficiency, it says for residential land, the buildable land inventory must include, and I think it may be more than what this group is tasked with, but I think using consistent terms and being very clear what lands we're talking about consistently is extremely helpful for those of us who then have to implement these rules. And I think we all know that residential land in this context no longer means just residential land, but that's kind of what it says. So to the extent we can correct all of those, that would be excellent. And again, I'm not to be too nitpicky. I also picked up on this housing needs allocation term, but for a different reason than Brock. Because I think, again, being really nitpicky, I would like you to use the exact same term that's used elsewhere. And I think what you're talking about is the allocated housing need that's in ORS 197.015. And I would like to see those direct connections as these rules are written with the exact same terms, because again, it makes it easier for us to look at this and say, oh, that's exactly what they mean. And then if you go to 197.015, the allocated housing needs is defined. And so it's just very clear.
Thanks,
But
Martha.
I'll have to think about this whole contextualized housing need little twist that Brock threw in there. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Martha.
Yeah.
Other folks with specific thoughts on modifications to what's been proposed? Not seeing any hands, so apparently maybe our clarifying questions raised what people were thinking about. Let's see here. Yeah. Karen, did you have any specific questions that you wanted to get feedback from the group on, like more detailed questions than what we've already asked?
I think, well, we'll see. I'll ask the group if they want to chat about this, and if not, we can give you all the time back. But something that came to me was this understanding of how redevelopable has been applied in the BLI, and how cities are selecting and sort of forecasting what they think might be redevelopable. And it's very different in metro. So notice that we haven't proposed a safe harbor on how to do that. And I'm wondering if I can see maybe a show of hands, because I don't have a poll for this. For most practitioners, does that make sense why DLCD staff chose not to provide any safe harbor or any type of reduction factor for redevelopable? Because the way you're inventorying it, I'm assuming you're like, yes, we know where we have the highest potential for redevelopment. We, in our capacity analysis, will provide that estimated capacity of what we might get for the conversion. Otherwise, we don't see the need to have a generalized safe harbor, nor do we need any additional rule amendments that prescribe how we do it. We like the flexibility that current rule provides. We could use more guidance and tools.
I'm going to flip your question, Kanan, and ask people to raise their hand if they don't. I think you said if you do understand, but I think sometimes people are default to not raising their hand. So if you do not understand why staff took the approach they did, as Kanan just described, please raise your hand. And Brock, you got caught in the middle. So I don't know if you have something you want to say or. Okay. It seems like folks understand, but Brock has a question.
Yeah, and again, kind of a technical language one, but for that definition of redevelopable land, part of it, there exists the strong likelihood that it'll redevelop, essentially. What does that strong likelihood translate to in practice? Like, is that a 50% confidence interval? Is it 75%? Is it 90? Like, what's the kind of threshold there? And Beth is laughing, so I'm assuming this is a good answer, but
I should probably punt to Beth districts or things of that nature. I've experienced at the local level, there'll be what's considered some catalyst sites, and you presume that over that planning period or even within a shorter time frame, the city has created enough incentives and support around some redevelopment. They might even have some local knowledge from planners around property owners that are working with the city, and maybe there's been some pre-app applications, so we're going to estimate some capacity. I don't know that I've ever, help me out, Beth or Kevin, jump in, that there's been a threshold or a defining generalization.
No, and I would say as a former local government planner, the idea of mapping this property is ripe for redevelopment and this one isn't. Oh my God, I would never want to do that. And so when we're looking at the estimation of redevelopment, I tend to think of like, okay, let's look at like a market study more globally. Let's look at our recent redevelopment rates. Let's look at middle housing that we've produced over the last 5 years and just, okay, that's the trend that we're observing. But I mean, to me, like setting that threshold and saying this property is going to redevelop and this one isn't is very problematic, I think.
yeah, and I think it a parcel by parcel basis, I definitely agree. That's just not an efficient way to plan it, but
We
or
tried to
equitable.
do some of what you're talking about once for a city who I think I'll decline to name, where we looked at a very simple measure, which is a very flawed measure, which is improvement to land value ratio, and said everything that had a ratio of less than 0.75, so the improvement was worth less than the land, would redevelop or had, stronger chance of redeveloping, and that resulted in some ridiculous amount of land. And here I am 10 or 15 years later, maybe it's 15 or 20 years later, haven't seen that kind of redevelopment. And how do you walk that back, Brock, once you've said, we're going to see all of this happen, but maybe we won't because that's an unreasonable amount in some way, and unreasonable is a hard word. So the quantifying is hard with a lot of cities. There's a lot of knowledge about what landowners want to do. It's so, and redevelopment is inherently the reasons that people don't redevelop their parcels are sometimes really illogical. And just, it's owned by 3 or 4 people and they can't agree what to do, or they're mad at their brother, or absentee and don't really care. So this is one place where a little more flexibility, I think will probably yield a better outcome, is my opinion.
oh, absolutely, that makes sense. And those are the kinds of things that I was thinking of too. And so initially, before the first section of discussion, I was going to say maybe adding and redevelopable into that land inventory in response to deficiency category with the market supply factor. But if the current thresholds that we're using are already reducing that, which is what I think I heard staff say, in effect, even if not in letter of the law, but yeah.
Mary Kyle.
Yeah, this discussion brought back bad memories of what I don't know if it was Beth or Beth's predecessors who were involved with the streamlined UGB process.
Yeah, that was my predecessor.
Yeah, that's what I was pretty sure, but it was me also. and trying to, there's a formula in there, and I doubt anyone's used it. It gives me a headache just to reread it. But I'm with Karen, like leaving it flexible. Like local governments know if you have a TIF or you're putting in a new light rail line, you have a pretty good basis to assume there's going to be redevelopment within a certain area. But otherwise, it seems like it's something that it's very much more localized. If you can come up with a formula that works for your city, great. But just looking at what's in this rule, it was well intentioned, but I don't know if it's ever been used. So Beth can blame one of her predecessors for coming up with it.
Well,
I left math behind.
Thanks, everyone. Just great, really thoughtful questions and comments about both partially vacant land and redevelopment. We heard some language that maybe could be more straightforward that we need to revisit. The question about the word residential in those definitions, and some support anyway for the possibility of a market factor, safe harbor for larger cities. We'll take a look at all those things. Did I miss anything, Karen, that you want to point out?
No, I will just say I'm so appreciative that you guys really centered your recommendations around here's staff, DLCD, here's the department's opportunity to create more clarity beyond what we saw as obvious. So yes, you sort of hit that bullseye of there's still some additional tweaks to rule that would even more so clarify. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, so helpful. So our next meeting is on May 15th. We are going to be talking about land use efficiency measures, revisiting BLIs and natural hazards and natural resource constraints, looking at UGB suitable land that constraints, both inside and outside the UGB. So you can look forward to that. The RAC meets next on May 7th, and we'll be having a discussion, or our staff team here will be leading a discussion with them around development ready land inventory. So picking up where you all left off and sharing that with that group to see where they might take it from there. So and I believe there will be a Miro board link sent out. So as you talk to your colleagues and have further thoughts or recommendations about how we can address the topics we brought up today, please chime in through that Miro board, or you're always welcome to email any of us as well. So with that, thank you all. And Kevin, did you have something?
I just, that other slide said May 17, and I just wanted to, it's the 15th, just so everybody's on the same page.
15th,
Great.
yeah.
Yeah.
15th.
Great.
Okay.
On the 15th. Hey, I just, for the record, I do want it noted that I'm giving you all 6 minutes back.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good day.